Alright, so goodbye Calvin cycle. Well guys, if you've made it this far, you should pat yourself on the back. If you haven't broke down in tears or pulled any of your hair out, you've done pretty good. So that's the basics of photosynthesis, and we've already covered the basics of respiration in Chapter 9. Those are perhaps two of the most complex, largest, most important metabolic processes that we're going to look at. So Chapter 9 and Chapter 10 were both heavy and both tough to digest. We're going to finish up Chapter 10 here with just a couple of variations of photosynthesis, just like in respiration where we talked about the main form of respiration was aerobic respiration with oxygen as the final electron acceptor after the electron transport chain. But we also mentioned that there is anaerobic respiration, which uses an electron transport chain but uses something other than oxygen as the final electron acceptor. And then we also mentioned fermentation, which is completely well, I wouldn't say completely, but slightly different in that it doesn't use the electron transport chain, doesn't create nearly as many ATP. So there were some variations of respiration, and that's going to be the case in photosynthesis as well. There are some variations. We're going to take a look at two of those variations right now. Concept 10.4 says alternative mechanisms of carbon fixation have evolved in hot, arid climates. Again, going back to the idea that evolution is kind of the keystone for understanding and studying biology, it is continually amazing to me how creatures adapt to their environment and overcome some very harsh conditions to live, and to continue to thrive and reproduce and move forward. So we're going to look at two alternatives to normal everyday photosynthesis, and these normally occur in hot, dry conditions, and you'll see why in just a moment. Plants, since they are pretty much stuck in place for the most part, we're talking about land plants, they have a problem sometimes getting water. They can't go to the water, they have to wait for the water to come to them to some degree. So dehydration is a major problem, particularly in hot, arid climates, and so sometimes this requires the plant to create some trade-offs with other metabolic processes, because the problem is on hot, dry days, as you open those stomata in the leaves, you're going to lose a tremendous amount of water due to transpiration. So if the plant lives in a hot, dry, arid climate, it's going to lose an enormous amount of water during the daytime hours through those open stomata via transpiration. So to limit that loss of water, oftentimes it will close off those stomata. Well, that creates a second problem, because closing off the stomata limits the access to carbon dioxide from the air, and it starts to allow a buildup of oxygen within the cells themselves. Both of these are negative conditions, and they lead to a somewhat wasteful process called photorespiration. So let's take a look at that photorespiration process. We're going to start by looking at what's called C3 plants. Those are the majority of plants that you see, land plants that you see out there in the world. They're called C3 because the initial product that they form by fixing carbon dioxide using rubisco is a 3-carbon compound. So they're called C3 plants. In photorespiration, the problem is that rubisco grabs oxygen instead of carbon dioxide in the Calvin cycle, and it produces a 2-carbon compound. Photorespiration consumes oxygen and organic fuel and releases carbon dioxide, but it doesn't produce ATP or sugar. So this is a bit of a problem. It's kind of a wasteful procedure that's going on, where we're using up oxygen, we're using up fuel, we're creating carbon dioxide, and we're not creating ATPs or sugars. And that happens because rubisco mistakenly grabs oxygen instead of carbon dioxide. It has an affinity for both, and if the oxygen level becomes high within the cell, it will often grab the oxygen instead of the carbon dioxide. This is important to mankind because some of the agriculturally important C3 plants include rice and wheat and soybeans. These are some mainstay crops for humans throughout the world. So when these plants are doing this process of photorespiration and they're not being very efficient, they're not producing as much as they possibly could in the way of crops, which again goes back toward feeding human beings. It's generally thought that this process called photorespiration is kind of an evolutionary relic. Again, I'll mention kind of like the appendix of a human anatomy digestive system. because the thought is that Rubisco first developed or evolved at a time long, long ago before there was a heavy amount of oxygen in our atmosphere. The early Earth atmosphere was fairly low in oxygen, so it wouldn't really have mattered that Rubisco had an affinity for both because there was far less oxygen around at any rate, so it wasn't that big of a deal. Now, because the level of oxygen is quite a bit higher, and that's due to plants and photosynthesis, it can be a problem. Photorespiration does do some good in that it limits the buildup of products that can be damaging coming from the light reactions when the Calvin cycle is not working or moving very quickly. So when you have problems, say for example these stomata are closed and you don't have the carbon dioxide coming in for the Calvin cycle, well, you may still have the light products from the light reaction still being created. And actually a buildup of some of those products can be damaging to the plants. So this photorespiration will help get rid of those products so you don't have an overflow of those products from the light reaction. But other than that, it's not very helpful. It's actually quite wasteful. It's estimated that on a hot, dry day, this photorespiration can drain as much as 50% of the carbon fixed by the Calvin cycle. So that's a major loss in efficiency for the plant in creating glucose, and that goes into sugars and starches that help build the plant and the crops that we might eat as well. So one variation, kind of a problematic, inefficient variation of photosynthesis is photorespiration. So photorespiration is where Rubisco attaches oxygen, brings in oxygen instead of carbon dioxide into the Calvin cycle, and that causes quite a bit of problems. The next thing we're going to look at are a different kind of plants called C4 plants. C4 plants have an adaptation that allows them to help get around this photorespiration problem. And they're called C4 plants because they create as their initial product, when they combine carbon dioxide, when they fix carbon dioxide, they create a 4-carbon compound in the mesophyll cells. Some important C4 crops include sugarcane and corn. You'll notice most of those are kind of like grass-type crops. These C4 plants, this C4 adaptation is particularly helpful in hot regions where you have intense sunlight, where stomata are often partially closed during the day, where otherwise you would have a huge amount of photorespiration, which we already know is problematic and very inefficient. So what happens is this step uses an enzyme called PEP carboxylase or PEP carboxylase, and it actually makes it into a two-step process. So PEP carboxylase has a much higher affinity for carbon dioxide than Rubisco does. So it is much more attracted to carbon dioxide than Rubisco, and it's not really attracted to oxygen at all. So even when the oxygen amounts are high and the carbon dioxide is low, this PEP carboxylase can do its job. It can fix carbon dioxide even when there's not a lot of it around. And what it does is it fixes carbon dioxide into a particular 4-carbon compound. And that 4-carbon compound is taken to a different part of the plant, taken to cells called bundle sheath cells. And then that 4-carbon compound is broken back down and the carbon dioxide is released there for the Calvin cycle. So here's how the C4 plants get around this problem of photorespiration and low carbon dioxide levels because the stomata are closed. They subdivide the process into 2 separate areas. So here you have the mesophyll cells, which are kind of like the regular cells where normal photosynthesis goes on, and then you have these bundle sheath cells right here. So we're going to divide it into 2 steps instead of just in a single spot. We're going to do this in 2 spots. So in the first place, in the mesophyll cells, where carbon dioxide is low and oxygen is high because we have stomata closed, there is some carbon dioxide in there. And we're going to use this enzyme, PEP or PEP carboxylase, which is very attracted to carbon dioxide. It fixes the carbon dioxide into a particular product that is then taken into this separate area. And in this separate area, the carbon compound is broken back down into CO2, and then that CO2 is picked up by Rubisco in the Calvin cycle, and it goes about its way. So because we separate these 2 areas, the Calvin cycle is occurring in this area that's high in CO2 and low in oxygen. We don't have to worry about the normal area here that might be low in CO2 and high in oxygen. because we're separating this process into two stages, into two separate areas. So that's how these C4 plants get around this problem of hot, dry weather and closing off the stomata. Kind of as a side note to carbon dioxide levels and higher temperatures, if you think about some of the scientific things that have been going on lately, some of the various primarily political controversies, because in the world of science it's not really very controversial as far as global warming and changes in greenhouse gases. In the last 150 years, it is a scientific fact that CO2 levels have risen, and most scientists who study climate, by far, the vast majority would tell you that that is primarily caused by man's activities in burning fossil fuels and things like that. So we've increased the levels of CO2, which you may have heard some people, usually not very highly scientifically trained people, say, well, that's good. I mean, that should be beneficial to all plants. And in a way, that could be correct. Higher amounts of CO2 could be beneficial, and it may affect these three C3 and C4 plants slightly differently. But in some cases it might be beneficial. But along with those increased carbon dioxide levels comes the increased greenhouse effect, and so you have a change in temperature, which kind of has, for most plants, for the C3 plants in particular, the opposite effect, where the higher temperatures induce the plant to close their stomata, which causes more photorespiration, which is less efficient. So what exactly might happen as far as how would global warming and higher CO2 levels affect the distribution of certain species of plants? That's pretty unpredictable. So I would take it with a grain of salt, particularly when you hear people that don't work in these scientific fields of climate study and plant pathology and plant physiology and things like that. If they start talking about, well, this is going to be a straight up benefit or this is going to be a straight detriment, it's usually a combination of both. By now you've probably seen that biology is pretty messy, and clear-cut answers are not often very easily found. So just keep that in mind when you hear these political debates. The last thing for us to take a look at is a very interesting adaptation by some plants. These are desert plants like succulents and cactus. What do? Because they live in an environment that is almost strictly hot, dry, arid, where they would be very prone to losing water if they had their stomata open for any length of time. Well, these plants are called CAM plants, C-A-M, CAM plants, and they've got a pretty cool adaptation as well. They're called CAM because, again, that's shortened for this long phrase, which is crassulacean acid metabolism. So crassulacean acid metabolism, crassulacean acid is one of the products that is part of this process. So they're called CAM plants. And what they do is, instead of doing like the C4 plants, where the C4 plants separate the process into two physical separate areas, the CAM plants do the photosynthesis process in the same area, but they separate it by time. CAM plants actually open their stomata at night, which is kind of odd because you would think the Calvin cycle has to occur with the light reactions during the day. But CAM plants open their stomata at night. They take in carbon dioxide and they fix that carbon dioxide into organic acids that they store, one of those being crassulacean acid. Then during the day they close off most of their stomata, and the CO2 that was stored in those organic acids is released and used in the Calvin cycle. That way during the day, when the light reactions are going and ATP is being created, the Calvin cycle has the energy it needs and it gets the carbon dioxide then from these stored organic acids. So just as a quick review of some of these differences, in C4, the initial carbon fixation step is separated into two separate areas from the Calvin cycle. That way the Calvin cycle can use Rubisco, and it's in a high carbon dioxide environment. So the initial fixation of the carbon is in a separate area, and it uses a special material that is more attracted to the CO2. In the CAM plants, the initial carbon fixation occurs in the same area as the Calvin cycle, but it's going to be separated by time. The initial fixation occurs in the nighttime, and then the Calvin cycle occurs during the day. All of these systems, whether it's regular C3 plants or C4 or CAM plants, they all eventually use the Calvin cycle to produce G3P and on to glucose, but there's some variations in how they deal with their environment. So here are those two major variations to get around that whole photorespiration problem that C3 plants often have. If you live in a hot, dry environment like these plants, like sugarcane and pineapple, the sugarcane uses the C4 method, where it actually separates the fixing of the carbon and the Calvin cycle into two separate areas. And then the pineapple uses the CAM method, where it occurs in the same area, the fixation of carbon and the Calvin cycle, but one happens during the night, fixing it into organic acid, and releasing that carbon dioxide during the day when the Calvin cycle has the energy that it needs from the light reactions. So these are two variations on the theme. Again, adaptations caused by evolution depending on their environment. So let's wrap it up with a quick review of the importance of photosynthesis. Hard to state enough that photosynthesis is perhaps the most important chemical reaction on the planet. Photosynthesis makes an estimated 160 billion metric tons of carbohydrates per year. That would be equivalent to, the book says, 60 trillion copies of your biology textbook. That would be 17 stacks of your biology textbook reaching from the earth to the sun. That is a mind-boggling amount of material. So plants do an excellent job of taking sunlight and converting it into chemical stored energy in the form of sugars and carbohydrates that the rest of all of life on Earth can use. So this energy enters the chloroplast as sunlight. It gets stored as chemical energy in organic compounds. Sugars made in the chloroplast are what provide all the chemical energy and the carbon skeletons that form all the rest of the organic molecules of the plant cells and any animal cell as well. So plants do make more than they need. So they take this extra energy, this extra glucose and sugars, they convert those into starches, and they put those in places like their roots, tubers such as potatoes, their seeds, and their fruits. So starch can kind of be thought of as plant fat. Plants don't store extra energy in fat cells. Instead, they store it in starch. But that's kind of the equivalent of how animals store it in fat cells. And of course, in addition to food production, we can't forget oxygen. Photosynthesis as a byproduct produces oxygen, which allows for life as we currently know it on Earth to exist. So again, today, if you're not what would be considered an environmentalist, a tree hugger, well, today at least, as you go outside, you should at least give a high five to the nearest oak tree, because it is definitely producing the food and the oxygen that we as consumers need to live. So one last little slide here. You can take a look at this. This is just kind of a quick, brief overview again. So energy comes in as light. It eventually leaves as a sugar. In this case, they put sucrose, but it could be glucose or something like that made from the G3P molecule. Very exciting. Photosynthesis, it is definitely pretty cool. And I wish I could do that. I wish I could, for lunch, go out and stand out in the sun for 30 minutes and get full. Or for Thanksgiving dinner, I would go to a tanning booth, and it would be like an all-you-can-eat buffet. But I can't, because I am not a producer. I'm a consumer. We'll stop right there. Get ready for that exam number 2. If you have any questions, make sure you go online and join our conversation on the graded discussion. I'll see you there. Bye-bye.